to talk about the polyphony on the Arturia PolyBrute. Now, as you know, there are 12 oscillators, and those 12 oscillators can play 6 notes at a time with 2 oscillators per note. Okay, so typically, I mean, it's sort of default set to poly, so you have 6 notes. And that seems pretty straightforward. Of course, we have 12 notes if we bring in the second oscillator. But there is more to it than that. In the poly mode, if you hold settings and press poly in the poly mode, a screen comes up that allows you to decide the polyphonic allocation. Now, I have not memorized what each of these means. I do know that cycle means that it will assign oscillator 1 to the first note, oscillator 2 to the second note, oscillator 3 to the third note, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a variety of different ways that they will distribute the various oscillators available compared to what notes you're playing. And you have the ability to choose how that happens. I could not find a way to really adequately demonstrate some of the differences between these. But for example, Unison starts off with all of the oscillators on one note. So it's still polyphonic, but if you only play one note at a time, you have 6 oscillators on one note. And as you play more notes, the oscillators are allocated over again. And that's a pretty cool thing. So that's interesting. Let's see if there's any noticeable aural difference in poly reset. If there is, I don't know what it is, but obviously poly unison's it's a pretty obvious difference in the way that it distributes the various notes. Poly reassign. Yeah, some of these are not necessarily noticeable except under certain circumstances. So in any case, you have the ability to decide how the synthesizer distributes the oscillators to the notes that you play. And I think some of those things become more evident depending on the other setting, which is where do the notes come from when you're holding notes and then you add a note. So on the other side, we have steal oldest as the first setting. So like if I play this, if I play one more note after that, it's going to take the oldest note, which in this case is this lowest D, which it did. Or you could do steal lowest. Well, actually, let's do this so that we don't confuse these two. I'm going to do that same thing I just did, except for I'm not going to start with the lowest note. I'm going to do this. It's less easy to tell where that note was taken, but it was this D that was the oldest, the first note I played. You can also do steal oldest or steal lowest, which we'll recognize again. It didn't take the lowest note. Let's see if we have this. It's still the lowest notes playing. I wonder what it's doing. Okay. And then 7, steal none. You'll notice that E that I was playing just didn't even show up because it won't let you steal a note from some other place. So that is kind of the idea behind the steal and the poly allocation. So you just have normal polyphony when you're in the poly mode, and you have the ability to decide how the oscillators distribute as you play. Now, I'm looking forward to someone who does enough work to like find a way to distinguish really obviously, apart from setting number 3, what happens and why that would be a benefit. I don't know, but I'm sure there's a very good reason, and it seems like a really cool ability to have for some reason. The next thing is Unison, and what Unison does is it puts all of the oscillators, it becomes a monophonic synthesizer with 6 or 12 oscillators on each note. Now, my first synthesizer was a Juno 106, and it had a unison mode too. And I remember turning on the unison mode and going, "Ugh, what is that?" Now, with that synthesizer, the oscillators were DCOs, so all of the oscillators were pretty stable in pitch, and you just got this weird, large doubling sound that sounded hollow and strange. I'm like, well, I guess that's a sound you could use. But in this case, you have VCOs. So having 6 or 12 oscillators on one note, it has just a big sound. Now, if you would like to hear why that's a benefit. I mean, it makes a different sound, and that's really cool, but there are things that you can do to make this really stand out. So I'm going to bring you over to the patch section here, and I'm going to assign, although we haven't talked about this, so you can't possibly know what I'm doing over here. I'm going to assign LFOs to control the 2 different oscillators. So that's our oscillator 1. We can't hear oscillator 2. That is 6 notes all on this 1D. Listen to what happens when we set the LFO to control the pitch. You're like, wow, Mark, that sounds like you've set the LFO to the pitch. What's the big deal? All 6 of those oscillators are being modulated by the monophonic LFO. But even though we're in a monophonic setting, unison is monophonic, listen to what happens when we set it to poly. You get a very big sound. And why? Because when the LFO is in poly mode, that's 6 LFOs controlling the 6 oscillators independently. And if we go into settings, let's see, where would that be? Mode here, and we go to retrigger off, that means those LFOs are free running in addition to being modulated independently. So we just get a really cool sound. And that, to me, makes unison worthwhile. Whereas the old-fashioned unison was just a really big kind of grating sound. Now we have something akin to like a super saw. And we could bring in that second oscillator. And we could apply the same thing to it with the second LFO. Making it even crazier and bigger. I think that's really cool. And there's probably other things you can do because, you know, the filters are assigned to those oscillators too. It might be that you can split the filters up in some way. Is that a thing? I don't know. Who knows? Anyway, so unison, which is really giant, doesn't necessarily have to be so giant. And here's another thing. I'm going to turn both of these off to talk about. Now, if we do settings and unison, we get a different screen. And it allows us to decide the priority, whether the note priority lower, like a traditional mini mode, Playing above the note does nothing. Or priority higher. Playing above the note does something, but playing below the note does not. Or priority last. Which means you can play in either direction and still get that same sort of effect that you would get. Of course, legato on means you can't really hear it because I'm not using a filter. Legato means that the filter and envelope won't open again with held notes. So if you play one note and then you play other notes, the other notes don't trigger the envelopes. Legato off, and they will. And then there is legato glide, which is a different setting along those same lines. Okay, also, another thing that's important is you don't have to have all 6 or 12 notes playing. If you hold polyphony down, let's get out of settings, hold polyphony down and press a note, you can, over here there is a screen that says Unison voice count, and it allows you to decide how many oscillators you want per note. You can see the settings here. It has upper and lower for when you're in a split, because when you're in a split, which we'll talk about, you can have different settings for the two different voices in the split. Right now we can hear 6, or we can go down to 7 or 4 or 3 or just 2. And if you do experiments with what I showed you before about getting the LFOs to sort of independently harass the oscillators, these will all generate different outcomes, and it's really cool to be able to decide just how big you want this Unison thing to be. Okay, and then the next setting is, of course, mono. So mono all of a sudden your PolyBrute is a mono brute. How do you feel about that? Actually, you should feel pretty good, because once you have this setting, like, you have a super powerful, great sounding monosynth, really, and with functions that you'll never see in another monosynth. Not demonstrated by the sound I'm using. Okay, so in mono mode, you just have one of VCO1 and one of VCO2, styling the sort of, like, imitating the sort of synthesizer that simply has 2 oscillators, 1 and 2. However, that doesn't keep you from having some control. Again, you can decide the note priority and how you want your legato to work. So you have those possibilities as well. And keep in mind that once we get into timbrality, where we have split mode, you can have a monosynth on one side and a polyphonic synth on another side, which is just magic. Anyway, so yes, that is our polyphony section and the incredibly interesting and fascinating things you can do with it on the Arturia PolyBrute.